Okay, we are at the Folk Pottery Museum of Northeast Georgia, and our first interview today is with John Burrison, and he is the curator here. And John, let's talk a little bit about pottery. I know that's probably one of your favorite topics.
It is indeed.
Tell me a little bit about pottery in the country and why some areas of the country are so suited to the pottery craft.
Well, my interest is in folk pottery, traditional pottery that's often handed on in families or through apprenticeship, not the kind of pottery that you learn in school or do as a hobby. The traditional pottery, folk pottery, pretty well died out up north by the beginning of the 20th century. It was almost gone. But it was still very active, very much alive and well here in the South, where people still needed a lot of farming folk here to preserve their food in stoneware jars and jugs and crocks, and still churned in pottery churns. So this was an area of the country where it made sense to carry on that tradition, and because there was still a customer base for the potters who were often farmers themselves, and they made part of their living by selling their pots and making it on a seasonal basis along with their farming. So it supplemented their farming income, and basically the South retained a pottery tradition with its European roots much longer than the North did.
Why are there pockets? There seem to be pockets of a craft going on, particularly here in Georgia where we are.
Well, some of it had to do with where good clay was located and the kind of pottery that these potters made up here in White County and in Northeast Georgia generally from the beginning, going back to the 1820s, was stoneware. And you don't find stoneware clay everywhere. It's a fine-grained, relatively pure clay that fires gray or tan. There was a certain amount of stoneware clay in different areas of Georgia that these farmer potters tested and recognized were worth settling in those areas to carry on the craft. And those stoneware clay pockets tended to run along the fall line that runs from Augusta to Columbus, and so you had several pottery centers emerging in middle Georgia, eastern Crawford County, northern Washington County, the Jugtown Pottery Center along the Upson-Pike County line. But there were also stoneware pockets up here in North Georgia, in the upper Piedmont and the foothills of the mountains. Very few traditional potters working in the mountains or down in the coastal plain, partly because there just wasn't a lot of good stoneware clay there. But once the potters had discovered the clay and worked with it and realized that it was going to work for them, and they became successful at making and selling their stoneware, other potters were attracted. So it wasn't just that there was good clay, it was the kind of magnetic force of a successful pioneer potter attracting others who might train in his shop to begin with, might marry his daughter, and then decide to open up their own workshop. And so eventually you got what are sometimes called jug towns, or pottery communities, that were really agricultural communities where potters tended to cluster. Partly because there was good clay available, but partly because someone had been successful initially, and that attracted others.
It seems to be, the craft of folk pottery seems to be something that's handed down through the generations in a number of families. Why do you think that happens?
Well, a lot of the crafts traditions here in the South, especially in rural America generally, were carried on in families. In cities, you tended to have more of the European system of apprenticeship, where a teenager would apprentice with a master craftsman for so many years and then go off as a journeyman and maybe set up his own operation. Here in the South, that learning process, the development of the skill sets needed to produce good quality ceramics occurred in family settings. Now, I don't mean to say that there wasn't some apprenticeship that took place here, because this is still one way that our Northeast Georgia folk potters do learn the craft. They work often as adults with master craftspeople who are already established. Bobby Ferguson of Gillsville was noted for the fact that not only did he train members of his own family, but he trained others who wanted to learn the craft. People like Lynn Craven, who's featured in the exhibit here at the Folk Pottery Museum beginning today, learned that way. She came out of White County from a family that had been one of the oldest pottery families in the South, starting in North Carolina in the 1760s, and still making pottery in North Carolina. But some members of the family left North Carolina. They moved to North Georgia, to White County, to Mossy Creek, and Lynn is a descendant of that branch of the Craven family. But her father and grandfather had left the craft, so she learned about her family pottery history as an adult with her children grown, and decided to get back to it. And the only way she could do that was to work with another potter in the general area, Bobby Ferguson at Gillsville. And so she would drive down to Gillsville in Hall County and work with the Fergusons, Bobby and Mary and Stanley. And she learned a lot of the basic skills that way, and then went back to her own place outside of Cleveland and started doing extraordinary things using the local tradition as a foundation. So she learned to make ring jugs, which are kind of hollow circular jugs that you could carry on your shoulder. One of the hardest pottery forms to make on the wheel, but she worked at it for a year or so until she perfected it, and then she started decorating them with chicken heads and all kinds of grapes and flowers, but she's one of those folk potters in Northeast Georgia that learned through an apprenticeship, informal apprenticeship system, to be sure. And there are quite a few of the others too. And some of the other potters learned more in a garden pottery operation, like Craven's. Craven's are still making hand-thrown garden pots, horticultural wares for planting. And the younger guys who are working in that operation are learning their basic hand skills, and some of them go off, like Dwayne Crocker did and Michael Crocker did, and setting up their own workshops and getting back to the older glazed stoneware tradition with an appreciation of the history of that. So families were and still are important in carrying on the tradition, but they're not the only way you can become a traditional potter. But you don't want to think that you can become a folk potter in a few weeks or a few months. It takes years of training, it takes dedication, it takes not making a lot of money for several years before you establish a reputation and begin to attract a customer base. And remember, this is the folk pottery tradition is a business. These were professionals. They might have been working part-time rather than full-time, along with their farming or other jobs. But for them, this was a way to put food on the table. It wasn't a way to satisfy their artistic instincts. Although certainly they get satisfaction that way from working with clay. It's probably a lot easier to make pots than to plow a mule all day or to work in a textile mill. But it's still hard work because a lot of these potters dig their own clay, they chop their own wood as fuel to burn in their wood-burning kilns, they shape their pots on a foot-powered wheel, and you can't get into this craft business, which is what it is, and think that you're going to be successful overnight. And so a lot of people have gone into it that way and are out of it very quickly. So it's the people who have been persistent and had a dedication to the craft that are still with it today. And
what are some of the hardships that today's folk potters face?
well, I think what people may not appreciate is how the Great Recession, as we're calling it, has affected very small-scale businesses like these craft businesses, these folk potters. Often, and when I say small business, I'm talking about one-man operations in some cases, or a small family working together. And that's it. This isn't a factory. It's very much a hand-based home industry, if you want to call it that. And they depend on selling their ware now to collectors, who are their main customers. And a lot of people who've been collecting folk pottery are reluctant to spend their money on things they don't really need these days, which is ironic because generations ago, the same pottery would have been essential for survival, for preserving food and drink. But nowadays, it's kind of a luxury for decorating your home. And you can see that the pottery itself has changed to suit that change in the customer base. And a lot of it has gotten much more decorative, much more self-consciously artistic. But there's still, some of these potters are still making very simple pitchers and mugs and churns. And people still use the pitchers and the mugs, at least, and the plates the way they were meant to be used. But the more decorative work, and Ari Metters, Cheever Metters' wife, Lanier Metters' mom, was a key factor in that shift from utilitarian to more artistic wear. She developed on her own at the Metters Pottery in the 1950s and 60s some of the designs that the current generation of North Georgia folk potters have taken and run with and evolved in their own way. But these people are having a lot of trouble finding customers who will pay for pots that they may sell for $30 or $40 or $50 or $100 or $200 for the more elaborate pieces, when at the same time you can go to Kmart and such places, Pier 1, and buy imported pottery, ceramics from other parts of the world, selling for just a few dollars. So the competition with those imports made by people working under a kind of slave labor system, essentially, is one of the problems. But the other problem is that people, as you know, are now being very cautious about spending money beyond what they consider absolutely essential. And so the potters are all working out strategies for how to stay afloat in this economy. And I see it here in North Georgia. I also see it up in North Carolina, where there's a big pottery center surrounding a town called Seagrove, where there are potters that go back in their families for many generations, and some newer kind of school-trained studio potters who have moved there. But they're all struggling one way or another. And some have worked out a strategy for attracting customers to sell their ware, and others haven't quite figured out how to do that yet. So really, you know, if you want to get a sense of the impact of the current state of our economy, one way to appreciate it is to look at these small craft businesses and watch them struggle to deal with the conditions so that they continue doing what they love to do. Because it sure beats, you know, flipping burgers at McDonald's.
Thank you so much, John.
Sure.